guys, welcome to the next chapter in the story, chapter 5, which is the footprints in the dew. So Tom has decided to go out into the garden. So he's gone outside anyway. He's going outside to have a bit of an explore to see what the garden's like. Okay, so here we go. The footprints in the dew. There is a time between day and night when landscapes sleep. Only the earliest risers see that hour, or the all-night traveller, letting up the blind of his railway carriage, looking out onto a rushing landscape of stillness, in which trees and bushes and plants stand immobile and breathless in sleep, wrapped in sleep as the traveller himself wraps his body against his great coat or his rug the night before. This grey, still hour before morning was the time in which Tom walked into the garden. He'd come down the stairs and along the hall to the garden door at midnight, but when he opened the door and stepped out into the garden, the time was much later. All night, moonlight or swathed in darkness, the garden had stayed awake. Now, after that long night-long vigil, it had dozed off. The green of the garden was greyed over with dew. Indeed, all of its colours were gone until the touch of sunrise. The air was still, and the tree shapes crouched down upon themselves. One bird spoke, and there was a movement when an awkward parcel of feathers dislodged itself from the tall fir tree at the corner of the lawn, seemed for a second to fall, and then at once was swept up and along, outspread on a wind that never blew, to another further tree, an owl. It wore the ruffled, dazed appearance of one who's been up all night. Tom began to walk around the garden on tiptoe. At first he took the outermost paths, gravelled and box-edged, intending to map for himself the furthest extent. Then he broke away impatiently on a cross-path. It tunnelled through the gloom of the yew trees, arched overhead from one side and hazelnut stubs from the other. Ahead was the green-grey triangle of light, where the path must come out into the open again. Underfoot the earth was soft with the hums of last year's rotted leaves. As he slipped along like a ghost, Tom noticed, through gaps in the yew trees on his right, the flick of a light lighter colour than the yew. Dark light, dark light, dark. The light of the colour, he realised, was the back of the house that he was glimpsing. And he must be passing behind the line of yew trees that faced this across the lawn. His path came out by the asparagus beds of the kitchen garden, so he found them out to be later. Beyond their long grave-like mounds was a dark oblong, a pond. At one end of the pond, and overlooking it, stood an octagonal summer house, with an arcaded base and stone steps up to its doors. The summer house, like the rest of the garden, was asleep on its feet. Beyond the pond and the summer house was another path, meandering in idle curves. On the other side of this path was a stretch of wilderness, and then a hedge. On the four sides of the garden, Tom had already observed that three were walled, one by the back of the house itself, another by a very high wall built of church blocks and bricks, and another by a lower wall that might prove climbable. A hedge, however, is almost always more easily passed than any wall, and Tom had no sooner got into his garden than he was curious to see outside it. Sharp-edged, he searched the hedge for a little way through. He needed only make a little hole for a push and a wriggle. Here was a narrow gap at last, but to his surprise it led into the hedge instead of directly through it. From this entry a passage, about a foot wide and 3 feet high, had been worn along the heart of the hedge. Tom crept along it. The tunnel came to an end where there was another bolder gap into the open, this time out to the far side of the hedge. Tom found himself looking out over a meadow. There were cows in the meadow, some still at their night's rest, one getting up, hind legs first, and one all ready to the day's work of eating. This last cow stopped grazing to stare at Tom, as though she thought she must be still dreaming. Stalks of grass hung down from the sides of her mouth, and a long trickle of saliva descended from her lip and swung slightly in the light morning breeze that was getting up. At the far side of the meadow, a long grey goose-neck rose from the grasses, and Tom could see the bird's head turned sideways, so that an eye could fix itself upon the gap in the hedge and the movement there. As a matter of fact, the lookout was a gander, although Tom didn't know it. A moment later, the white necks of all his wives rose around him, watching too. Then the gander strained his neck and breast upwards and stretched his wings out into a splendid double curve, every pinion apart, and clapped them to and fro. First one goose, then another one did the same, saluting the new morning. Tom, made uneasily aware of the passage of time, crept back by the way he had come, back into the garden. He began to make himself familiar with it, its paths and alleys and archways, its bushes and trees. He noted some of its landmarks. At a corner of the lawn, a fir tree now towered up above all the other trees in the garden. It was wound about with ivy, through which its boughs stuck out like child's arms through the wrappings of a shawl. On the high south wall, half covered by the sporting of a vine, there was a sundial. It was surmounted by a stone sun with stone rays, and its chin was buried in curly stone clouds, looking rather like his father's chin, covered in shaving lather, Tom thought. To one side of the sundial and the honeysuckle archway was a door. Tom might have tried it, but the sight of the sundial, even without the sun upon it, had reminded him of the passing of time, so he hurried. At the greenhouse, he did no more than look through the glass at the plants inside, and at the water tank, where a gleam came and went, perhaps a goldfish waking. The raised cucumber frames by the greenhouse were walked round in less than a minute. He passed hastily along beside the aviary, where fan-tailed pigeons were beginning to pick their way across the brick floor. He crisscrossed the kitchen garden beyond the asparagus beds, fruit trees and strawberry beds and bean poles, and a chicken wire enclosure where raspberry canes and gooseberry bushes and currant bushes lived sheltered from the attack of birds. Beside the gooseberry wire grew a row of rhubarb. Each clump was covered with the end of an old tub or a drain pipe with sacking over the top. Between the loose staves of one of the tub ends was something white, a piece of paper. It was folded and addressed in a childish hand, if one could call it an address, to Oberon, the king of the fairies. Tom certainly didn't want to be mixed up with talk of fairies and that kind of thing. He moved very quickly away from the rhubarb bed. He came out again upon the lawn. Here there were flower beds and the crescent-shaped corner beds with the hyacinths, already which an early bee was working. The hyacinths reminded Tom of his Aunt Gwen, but no longer with resentment. She knew nothing, poor thing, and could be blamed for nothing after all. At the verge of the lawn, Tom stopped abruptly. On the grey green of the dewed grass there were two clearly defined patches of darker green, footprints. Feet had walked on the lawn and stood there, then they turned back and walked off again. How long ago? Surely since Tom had entered the garden. I'm sure they weren't here when I came out, certain. How long had whoever it stood there been, and why? He or she had faced the line of yew trees opposite, and that made Tom uneasy. When he'd passed between those trees and seen the flick, flick, flick of the house between them, had someone been standing on the lawn watching the flick, flick, flick of Tom as he went? Tom looked at the house, letting his eye go from the window to window. Had someone drawn out of sight at an upper window? No, now he was just imagining things. Tom's nerves were on edge, and he actually jumped when he heard a noise coming up from the garden. It was the sound of a door opening. He took cover at once and then worked his way towards the sound. Someone had come through the door in the sundial path, a man with a wheelbarrow. Tom took a moment to realise that this must be a gardener, and that he was doing nothing more sinister than beginning a day's work. He was whistling, and now Tom became aware that for some time the garden had been filled with sounds, the sounds of birds and the sounds of leaves moving in morning winds, and of all the minute living, breathing sounds of trees and bushes and plants and insects. The sun's rays gleamed all over the garden, warming it to life and sucking up the drenching dew. The sundial's iron finger threw a shadow at last and told the time. Day was beginning, and Tom was afraid of being caught in a daytime that was not his own. Once again he crossed the lawn, this time with intent to get back into the house and upstairs to bed, if indeed his own room and bed were there. He could see that the hall of the house was furnished with all the objects he'd seen the other night, and the morning sun lit them clearly. They looked forbiddingly real. Fear made him hurry now, yet even so he paused on the threshold of the house and turned back to look at the footprints on the grass. They were still plainly visible, although the warmth of the rising sun was beginning to blur their edges. It didn't strike him as odd that his own footprints, which had crossed the lawn again, had left no similar trace. He went inside and shut the garden door behind him and bolted it. He'd shut himself into absolute darkness, but he could still hear the ticking of the grandfather clock, and that gave him his bearings. He felt for a bracket to guide himself forward unaccountably. He missed finding any bracket. He made for where the barometer should be, and he found only a blank wall. Then he realised there was an emptiness all around him, and the furniture was gone. Only the clock was left, but the clock was always there, time in and time out. It had been in the hall with the furniture and the rugs and the pictures, and now it was here in the bare hall of daytime. If the hall were as usual, then everything was as usual, and Tom was safely back in his own time, and his bed would be waiting for him upstairs. Yet now a lesser fear came to him with a pang of conscience. The ticking of the grandfather clock reminded him. There was no 13th hour marked on the clock face. He had not had that excuse of being out of bed. nor had he been right in thinking this little expedition would only take a few minutes anyway. He dared not think how much time he'd spent in the garden. He'd gone there before dawn, and he'd come away when the sun was up. He went back upstairs to the flat and straight into the kitchen to consult the clock there. It was an ugly little clock, but it always kept perfect time. He found the kitchen matches and struck one, shielding both the sound of the striking and the flame. He thought it was better not to click on the electric light, lest even that might wake his aunt and uncle. He held the lighted match to the clock face, and the fingers pointed to only a few minutes past midnight. Still only a few minutes past midnight. Tom stared so long that the match burned down he had to drop it. He was bewildered, but one thing he knew now, that he hadn't broken his promise he made to his uncle. Tom tiptoed back to bed. He was right to make the little noise, for his uncle was only just upon the edge of sleep. Alan Kitson had just finished a one-sided conversation begun a few minutes earlier. If that grandfather clock strikes 1 in anything like the way it strikes 12, on and on and on and on, then I'll go upstairs and knock Mrs. Bartholomew up and complain. She needn't think I'm frightened of her. Okay, so that was chapter 5. Chapter 6, tomorrow, is called, well, not tomorrow, I'm going to read it Monday, it's called Through a Door. Now, just to recap, so that was quite a hard chapter to understand. So in that chapter, Tom had gone out into the garden. He'd had a good explore of it. So there were all the trees and the yew trees and the flower beds, and there were hedges, and there was a big wall as well. He'd noticed as well that there were footprints on the grass that didn't belong to him. He was a bit worried that somebody had been standing on the grass and was watching him going in between the yew trees. And he also noticed that where he was standing on the grass, there were no footprints. He's not making footprints. He also noticed when he went back in again that the clock, when he looked at the clock, even though it felt like he'd been in the garden for hours and hours, he'd actually been only there about 2 or 3 minutes in real time. So we'll have to see what happens then on Monday. So bye, guys. Bye.